Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book God's Not Dead by Rice Broocks. In this video, I'm going to cover chapter 5 of the book, which is titled Life is No Accident. So let's dive right in. Broocks begins with the example of Antony Flew, who was once an outspoken atheist and then embraced theism late in his life. And Flew said that a very strong influence on his change of mind was his opinion that life was just too complex to have arisen naturally without intelligent design. And Broocks says, quote, "Flew is not alone in recognizing the window into the world of the cell that has given us a glimpse of the fantastic complexity of life. Specifically, the developments over the last 40 years in biochemistry and biology have shown us the micro-universe of the cell and have led to the logical conclusion that life is no accident." Well, despite how Broocks frames the question, our options when considering the origin of life are not limited to intelligent design or accident. We can reject both of those propositions and accept the probability, as does the overwhelming majority of scientists, that life is a product of complex chemistry, which is anything but random and accidental. Broocks recalls the evidence, quote unquote, of a fine-tuned universe that he discussed in the previous chapter, saying that the universe was fine-tuned for the existence of life, and specifically for the existence of us. And he says that the emergence of life itself only serves to reinforce that conclusion, that there is a design and a great intention at work in the universe and in ourselves. Broocks describes the complexity of DNA. He brings up the example of Francis Collins, the scientist and Christian who mapped the human genome. Broocks calls Collins a vital voice for the evidence in the magnificent order and information that makes up this indispensable component of life, meaning DNA. He fails to mention, when he refers to Collins, that Collins is neither a creationist nor a proponent of intelligent design as it is usually promoted. In fact, Collins has overtly rejected both of those things. Collins is a theistic evolutionist, which essentially means that he accepts the scientific consensus on the evolution of life, but he believes that it was God's finger that tipped over the first domino, so to speak. Broocks cites Collins as a very impressive sounding ally for his argument, but he's about to argue for something quite different than what Collins believes. Broocks emphasizes the incredible complexity of the human genome. He says, quote, "Again, the probability it could have happened by chance is staggering. Have you ever received a pocket text? You get a few letters strung together that make no sense. It usually happens when people randomly touch their keypads without realizing that they are hitting keys. If you received a text that had an understandable message, like 'Don't tell anyone, but I won the lottery,' the chances the writer could claim the text was typed randomly would be astronomically improbable." Appeal to probability, for those of you who are keeping track of the apologetics tropes in this series. Probability arguments are useless against evolution because they assume, as Broocks does here, that the letters, as it were just randomly in the right place at the right time. They just sort of fell into the right configuration all at once. But evolution is not analogous to a pocket text. A much closer approximation of how evolution works is the Weasel program, a computer program created by Richard Dawkins in the 1980s to demonstrate how easily coherent messages can emerge from random strings of text if an equivalent of natural selection is imposed. There are actually online versions of the Weasel program that you can try for yourself. And the way it works is first you type out a phrase that you want the program to use as a target, and in his original program, Dawkins chose the phrase, "Methinks it is a weasel," from Hamlet, paying homage to the old cliche that if you had a room full of monkeys on typewriters, given enough time, they would eventually produce the works of William Shakespeare. Now, this is where the program becomes sort of an imperfect analogy for evolution, because life doesn't actually evolve toward a predetermined end. like the program will work toward that predetermined phrase. But by defining that phrase, that allows the program to simulate natural selection. What happens is a random string of letters is produced by the program, and then that string is reproduced over and over again in many, many generations. And every so often, a mutation will randomly appear in the string of letters. And the computer program will select for the string of letters that most resembles the target phrase, however very slightly it resembles it. If there's even a tiny bit of resemblance compared to the other randomly generated letter phrases, it will choose that one, and then it will reproduce that one, and then mutations will grow in that one, and it will continue for generation after generation until eventually the proper letters will be in the proper places, and the target phrase will emerge from a completely random series of letters. Using a form of selection, we can get to the proper phrase. And typically, it only takes several dozen generations to get to this point. The Weasel program was created nearly 30 years ago. By the way, Dawkins first referred to it in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, that was originally printed in 1986. And it's a fairly well-known program and a fairly well-known example. So there's really no excuse for someone like Rice Broocks, who is presuming to educate his readers about evolution, to pretend that his pocket text comparison is anywhere close to relevant. Broocks has either never heard of the Weasel program, or he's hoping that his readers haven't, because he asks this rhetorical question, quote, "Was life engineered by intelligence, or did it arise spontaneously from random processes?" No. Life was neither engineered by intelligence, nor was it the spontaneous product of random processes. We don't know how life began, and perhaps we'll never know exactly how life began. It's one of the big questions. It's perhaps the biggest question in the life sciences. Where did life come from? How did life originate? But we do know that the process by which life evolves is not random, and the chemical processes of which life fundamentally consists are not random either. So I'd say arose spontaneously from random processes is a bad bet. And so is intelligent design, since there's no actual evidence for it. By the way, notice how Broocks is jumping back and forth between abiogenesis and evolution. Go ahead and check that one off the list, trope watchers. Equivocation. Next, Broocks does a decent job of briefly summarizing what natural selection is and how it works. And he admits that life does evolve, sort of. Quote, "Evolution is certainly observable within a species or genus. Even a single type of bird, like the finches Darwin observed, have massive amounts of variety. This type of evolution is called microevolution. However, this process can only drive very limited changes. The theory that this process could eventually cause one species to evolve into another significantly different one, like a fish becoming an amphibian, is macroevolution. The former has been clearly observed. However, the latter has no experimental or observational support." Well, that last sentence is just flat out not true. A little poking around on the internet, starting with typing something like observation of speciation into the search engine of your choice, will yield many, many instances where new species have been observed evolving from pre-existing species. And if you're looking for a starting point for this sort of research, the TalkOrigins archive has an FAQ on the subject that is as good a place to start as any, and I will link to that in the description box of this video if you want to check that out. Also, I feel it necessary to point out, as I did when I reviewed the works of Ray Comfort in a previous An Atheist Reads series, that fish and amphibian are general terms used to refer to large groups of many different organisms. Fish is not a species. Amphibian is not a species. They are categories containing many species. The fact that Broocks either doesn't know or doesn't care about that distinction is further evidence that he should not be playing at being a biology professor. Broocks is talking about microevolution and macroevolution as though they are different things. Check. Biologists use these terms to refer to the same process, only at different scales. Microevolution is small-scale change within a species. Macroevolution, or speciation, is large-scale change that results in the emergence of a new species. But the point that Brooks misses, either intentionally or as a result of his ignorance, is that microevolution and macroevolution are both driven by the same thing: changes in organisms at the genetic level over multiple generations, which are caused by mutations and shaped primarily by natural selection. Macroevolution results from the accumulation of microevolutionary differences. They are the same process. Like his fellow apologists, Brooks is making the mistake of confusing the model of taxonomy, which humans created, for the reality that that model is meant to represent. The lines between species or between larger taxonomic groups were drawn by us to aid our understanding of the natural world. Brooks is treating these lines between species as though they are impenetrable, but they're not even actually there. There is no barrier preventing a species of fish from giving rise eventually to a species of amphibian. There is no reason to believe that evolution, given enough time, cannot result in organisms of one kind, to use the intentionally vague terminology of apologists and creationists, to become organisms of another kind. There is no barrier preventing that. Brooks summarizes Darwin's development of evolutionary theory and its central tenet that all life is related through a common ancestor. Brooks acknowledges that life is connected, but he denies that there is any evidence establishing that life evolved from a common ancestor. He says this, quote, "Yes, there are noteworthy connections between humans and chimpanzees, who share a significant percentage of the same DNA. But the real issue is how these observations are interpreted. These similarities between species could just as easily result from a common designer rather than a common ancestor." There are two main problems with what Brooks is saying here. First, he's presupposing that there was a common designer before he even looks at the evidence, not following the evidence to the most likely conclusion. Good scientists don't interpret evidence to make it look like it points to their preferred conclusion. Good scientists start with the evidence and follow it wherever it goes. Second, the way we can tell that humans and chimpanzees are related is the same way we can tell humans are related to each other. When two humans are found to share almost all of their DNA in common, we conclude that they are related. That is, that they share a common ancestor, since that's what the word related means in this context. So why should we assume that the genetic similarities between humans imply common ancestry, but genetic similarities between different species implies common design, not common ancestry? Is there a reason to make this different assumption for multiple species other than religiously motivated wishful thinking? I don't think there is. Next, Brooks decides that there is a distinction between evolution and abiogenesis after all, even though he's been using the two terms interchangeably for up to this point in the chapter. And he turns specifically to the subject of the origin of life. He says, quote, "According to Darwin's theory, every living thing, from algae in the ocean to elephants in the desert, was derived from one single-celled ancestor. Natural selection used the extremely rare occurrence of positive mutations and accumulated those variations to produce all the species of everything that is alive. But where did that original cell come from? How could something this fantastic just happen?" Who is saying it just happened? Nobody is saying it just happened. Life as we know it on Earth may only be a 3 or 4 billion year old phenomenon, but the molecules which combine and interact in such complex and interesting ways to create life are far older than that. The atoms that compose those molecules are far older than that. Some scientists think that certain biochemical processes on which life depends may have originated shortly after the Big Bang itself. So even though life on Earth is only a few billion years old, the essential stuff of life may be nearly as old as the universe itself. So this shit didn't just happen. As with his description of the evolution of new species, Brookes wants us to believe that a non-religious scientific worldview requires us to accept that the first life just popped into existence from one moment to the next. But just as speciation is the result of a long process, the emergence of the first organisms was probably something that happened gradually, incrementally. If we could somehow travel back in time to witness the origin of life, we would probably find that there was no particular moment when life appeared, and that the line between non-life and life is much fuzzier than people like Rice Broocks would have us believe, just as are the lines between closely genetically related species. These are not thick, black, sharp lines. They're kind of hazy and fuzzy, and there's a lot of gray area in between. Brookes refers to the show Mythbusters, one of his son's favorite shows. He says, "Well, it's nice to know that I have something in common with Rice Broocks' son." And he uses the show's premise as a kind of a cheap, awkward introduction into the subject of the Miller-Urey experiment, which Brookes refers to as a myth. He says it's been discredited and proven to be irrelevant because conditions of Earth's early atmosphere were eventually found to be different than those that were assimilated in the Miller-Urey experiment. So the idea that the experiment proved that life could have originated naturally is just a myth. Furthermore, Brookes quotes Hugh Ross, who asserts that life couldn't have emerged naturally on the primordial Earth because of the oxygen UV paradox, which states that if the early Earth contained oxygen, that oxygen would have interrupted prebiotic chemistry, which would have destroyed life on Earth right as it was beginning. While on the other hand, if there was no oxygen on Earth, which means there would have been no ozone layer, then ultraviolet radiation from space and from the sun would have penetrated the Earth, and that would have interrupted the prebiotic chemistry. So either way, whether the early Earth had oxygen or no oxygen, life would have been doomed before it even began. In trying to discredit the Miller-Urey experiment, Brookes ignores the fact that it has been repeated and refined countless times in the over 60 years since it was first performed. This is another, maybe, an apologetics trope that you can check off your list, treating outdated or archaic science as though it's the state of the art. The Miller-Urey experiment was a big deal at the time, and it still is a big deal, but it has been repeated and refined and improved upon in the 60 years since it was first performed. So trying to discredit the Miller-Urey experiment doesn't quite get Brookes as far as he thinks it does. And the most important thing about the Miller-Urey experiment is that its most significant result has been confirmed over and over and over again, that the organic compounds necessary for life form easily and would have been present and perhaps even abundant on the early Earth. The supposedly devastating fact of the oxygen UV paradox, which Brookes presents via Ross, is not considered a serious challenge to natural abiogenesis. It's probable that the first forms of life didn't require oxygen, and in fact would have reacted to oxygen as though it were a poison. And there are, many organisms existent on the Earth today that are anaerobic, that don't require oxygen, and that in fact oxygen is very hostile to. So this is not that far-fetched of a notion. And if those early life forms emerged deep beneath the ocean, perhaps in the areas surrounding hydrothermal vents, again, a good bet according to many theorists, that solves the UV problem, since the water would have been more than enough to protect those fragile biochemical processes from that destructive UV radiation, even if the Earth did not have an ozone layer. Also, maybe Brookes should try watching Mythbusters with his son every once in a while, and then maybe he might pick up something about how the scientific method actually works. If he's not too distracted by the explosions, that is. Lots of explosions on Mythbusters. Next, Brookes returns to the probability of life. Quote, "Life is beyond amazing. It's way beyond explanation. As biologists understand more and more about the processes of life, the intellectual leap is made to assume that its origins are explained easily through naturalism. The stunning miracle of how reproductive life emerged, male and female, is so impossible to imagine that it sounds like a fairy tale. And how did life know that every living thing needed a genetic code? or that all the parts of the eye had to appear at once. The sentences, "life is beyond amazing, it's way beyond explanation," combine to form, by definition, an appeal to incredulity. And I have no idea what the fuck he's going on about with the "how did life know we needed a genetic code" business. That's like asking, how did apple trees know they needed to have apples? From a child, that question would be endearing. From an adult, it is ignorant and simple-minded. But wait, Brooks isn't done yet. Trope watchers, checklists at the ready. Quote, in their book Evolution from Space, Fred Hoyle and Chandra Wickramasinghe argue that the probability of life arising on Earth on its own is on the order of 1 chance in 10 to the power of 40,000. They said it was the same probability that a tornado could blow through a scrapyard and piece together a Boeing 747 airplane full of gas, ready to fly. Yes, the tornado in a junkyard argument, also known as Hoyle's fallacy, although Brooks does not describe it as such when presenting the argument and attributing it to Fred Hoyle. As I mentioned earlier, the 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power probability argument is utterly meaningless because, like the evolution of life, the origin of life was not the result of a sudden, random, one-step occurrence. The building blocks of the earliest life forms didn't just happen to fall together in just the right configuration any more than the building blocks of a star just happened to spontaneously coalesce and undergo gravitational collapse all at once. And you guys who are more versed in math, you might also notice, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you can't calculate the probability of something unless you know what all the possible outcomes are. So probability calculations in things like this are just utterly meaningless. Brooks considers one of the most commonly made challenges to the notion of intelligent design, which is who designed the designer. He mentioned this back in chapter 1 as well, very briefly. Brooks attempts to dispose of this by pointing out that it's a logical fallacy. He quotes Daniel Kame, who criticizes Richard Dawkins for making this "who designed the designer" argument, by saying that we need not have an explanation of an explanation in order to accept that as a good explanation. And you know what? I mean, this is true. The problem with Brooks's explanation is that there is nothing whatsoever compelling us to accept it other than religiously driven motivation and religiously motivated wishful thinking. As I mentioned in the first video of this series, asking who designed the designer is a way of pointing out the folly of postulating a designer without evidence in the first place. It doesn't make sense to explain a complex phenomenon by imagining an even more complex phenomenon that could be responsible for it. That's not how science works. That's not how logic works. You don't just make up something that could hypothetically be responsible for the phenomenon. You look at the phenomenon, you study the evidence, and you come up with something based on the evidence. If it worked the other way, where we could just make shit up and say, well, if this were true, then that would account for it, then we would actually know very little about the universe. Because that's how we used to do it back in the day. And back in the day, we didn't know shit. Anyway, you ready for some more projection? Well, Brooks says of atheists using the principle of Occam's razor to dispose of the proposal that God designed the universe, quote, "These kinds of arguments are more like word games that serve as a red herring to divert the dialogue from a truly simple conclusion. Design points to a designer." Word games serving as red herrings to divert the dialogue from a truly simple conclusion, or as I like to call it, just to save time, apologetics. Design does point to a designer, by the way. Unfortunately for Brooks, the appearance of design does not. Anyway, back to the appeal to incredulity. Quote, "As was mentioned, the probability for a cell, an organ, or any of the millions of complex species coming into existence naturally is so fantastically small that biologists have to give natural selection godlike qualities. They justify their claim by arguing that all changes can be broken down into small steps. That's because the probability is so vanishingly small for random chance to explain the origin of life as well as the fantastic development of millions of complex species. Random chance doesn't explain the origin of life, and no scientist worth listening to claims that it does. And maybe they justify their claim by arguing that all changes can be broken down into small steps, because that's what actually fucking happens. It's not a dodge to avoid the bullshit, irrelevant probability argument. It's how evolution works. The probability argument is meaningless and impotent. That's how evolution works. Tiny changes, tiny incremental steps, one generation after another. Brooks appeals to irreducible complexity, citing the most common examples that we hear from creationists, which is the eye and the bacterial flagellum, living systems with many parts, all of which must be precisely in place and operating for the system to function. Well, there are specific refutations of the supposed irreducible complexity of the eye, the flagellum, and other common examples online that you can easily find if you need them. And actually, the best refutation of that irreducible complexity of the eye that I am familiar with is by Richard Dawkins. He has a great illustration of the evolution of the eye in one of his Royal Academy Christmas lectures from the early 1990s. And I'll post a link to that in the description of this video as well. But the underlying problem with the irreducible complexity argument is that it assumes that the current configuration of a complex system is the only possible configuration that could be of any use to the organism, or is the only way any of the individual components of that system could be of use. Just as the first life forms didn't rely on oxygen to survive, as we and many modern life forms do, the components of complex living systems didn't necessarily have their present function when they first appeared, and their present function is not necessarily their only possible function. We know, contrary to the apologist cliche, that half an eye is actually a great deal of use compared to a quarter of an eye or no eye at all. We also know that complex systems can result from evolutionary processes. A particularly well-demonstrated example of this is the Krebs cycle, which is a key component of cellular metabolism in aerobic organisms. Those factors, to me, combine to render irreducible complexity just another form of an appeal to incredulity. How does Brooks answer the challenge that he and other intelligent design proponents are committing a God of the gaps fallacy? Quote, "First, what is overlooked by the naturalists are the enormous and ever-increasing gaps in the naturalistic worldview. For instance, as science advances, cosmologists have increasingly difficult times explaining why so many features of nature were designed with us in mind." Catch that? Science has a hard time explaining why so many features of nature were designed with us in mind. Beg the question much? Also, he completely dodges the criticism. Did you notice that? He's sort of committing a what about it philosophy, or a what about it fallacy, where he says, yeah, God of the gaps, yeah, but what about God, what about gaps of naturalism? He completely fails to address the God of the gaps criticism. Also, it's probably not a good idea to deny that you're guilty of committing one logical fallacy while blatantly and quite clumsily committing another one. Brooks refers to William Dembski's 3 criteria for detecting design. Dembski's 3 criteria for detecting design are that the design cannot be the product of natural causes, it must be highly improbable, and it must contain specified complexity. And this is a unique concept created by Dembski, specified complexity, and Brooks explains it. Quote, "When these criteria are applied to the cell, particularly the information contained in DNA, the conclusion of design becomes apparent. The term specified complexity simply refers to patterns that contain some sort of identifiable pattern, such as the faces on Mount Rushmore. Applying these criteria to life, such as the information in the cell, clearly shows that life must be the product of intelligence. Patterns that contain some sort of identifiable pattern. Who edited this book? It's one thing for Brooks, an adult who presumably received some kind of an education, to write this semi-literate gibberish, but whose job was it to proofread this book? Who allowed that meaningless effigy of a fucking sentence to see print? Dembski's work, by the way, is roundly rejected by both the mathematical and scientific communities, and his concept of specified complexity is regarded as horseshit in much the same way as irreducible complexity is regarded. The fact that Dembski's biased circular criteria point to the conclusion of intelligent design when applied to life is about as relevant as the Tobacco Institute's conclusion that smoking wasn't bad for human health. Brooks attempts to address the so-called argument from imperfection, which is essentially, if God created everything and God is perfect, why aren't things better designed? And Brooks tries to address this criticism by first claiming that things which previously were thought to be useless, such as the appendix or junk DNA, were eventually shown to serve some functions after all, basically saying, well, maybe things aren't as imperfect as we think they are. And then he implicitly blames whatever imperfections there are in the design of life on human error. Now, he never comes out and says the imperfections are due to the sin of humanity, but based on previous statements in this book, Demons, I'd say it's safe to infer that that's kind of what Brooks is driving at. Finally, Brooks attacks the God, or he attacks the, I've got God on the gaps, God in the gaps on the brain. He attacks the gaps in the fossil record, which he says are consistent not with evolution, but with design. And he references the Cambrian explosion, which he describes this way, quote, "Complex life just appears. In fact, it appears suddenly, and then identified species never significantly change." So complex life just appears, and then never significantly changes. And I guess when we look further along in the fossil record and we see that those organisms are very different from the ones that we saw in the Cambrian rocks, we shouldn't assume that life has evolved in that time, but rather that God decided to reach down and pop some new animals into existence. Because that makes so much more sense than a carefully considered, painstakingly assembled, consistent scientific theory substantiated by mountains of evidence from a diverse range of disciplines. No, fuck that. You find an organism you can't identify from earlier in the fossil record, God must have just felt creative that day. Because things popping into existence spontaneously is ridiculous, unless you imagine that God is the one popping them. Then it makes perfect sense. Then, in fact, it makes even more sense than gradual evolution, or life being the product of gradually building chemical processes. Do you see how this makes sense? Do you see how this makes sense? Even when there are similarities between species in the fossil record, it doesn't suggest evidence of evolution to Brooks. Quote, "Dramatic similarities between unrelated species are extremely common, such as the similarities between the eyes of octopuses and humans. Therefore, simply identifying similarities between fossils does not prove those similarities are the result of common ancestry. Humans and octopuses do share common ancestry. There are no unrelated species. There's no such thing as a species that is totally genetically unrelated to another species. That's what evolution is. That's what common ancestry is. How can you argue with evolution by saying, well, look at humans and octopuses. They have similarities, but they're not genetically related. Yes, they are! Also, Brooks repeatedly says that the fossil record shows life forms appearing suddenly. Now, I try to give people the benefit of the doubt. I hate to accuse people of being dishonest unless I absolutely find it unavoidable. So I'll assume that Brooks is just too fucking ignorant to know that suddenly, on the time scale of evolution, means stuff that took only hundreds of thousands or millions of years to happen, as opposed to tens or hundreds of millions of years. Well, anyway, that's it for this chapter. The title of the chapter was Life is No Accident, but it might as well have been I have no idea what the fuck evolution is, so it must be real. Because even though there may be gaps in the fossil record, trust me, those gaps are nowhere near big enough to accommodate all the shit Rice Broocks doesn't know about evolution. I've used the term appeal to incredulity several times in this video, but it bears repeating here the conclusion, because at bottom, that's all intelligent design is. It's an appeal to incredulity. Look how complex these things are. They couldn't possibly have resulted from natural processes. You don't believe that, do you? That's a fallacy. That's bad science. And there is considerable evidence to the contrary. And it's still the best that apologists like Rice Broocks have got. Well, that is it for me this week. That's it for Chapter 5. I will be back in the next video in this series to review Chapter 6 of God's Not Dead, which is titled Life Has Meaning and Purpose. Aren't you glad to hear that? You thought that it had no meaning or purpose, didn't you? Well, it has meaning and purpose, and Rice Broocks will share that meaning and purpose with us in the next chapter, which I will review for you in the next video. So thank you guys so much for watching this. As always, I truly appreciate it. Please leave a comment. Let me know what you thought. Let me know what I got right, what I got wrong, what I did a good job on, what I could have said better. If you're an atheist, if you're a Christian, if you're some other category of belief or non-belief, whatever your response is, whatever you feel about this, I will be very interested in hearing about it, in reading about it, to be more precise. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next time.